this civilization. And we'll also be having a Kahoot quiz at the end of it. And that'll be the end of the Indian traditional culture presentation. Alright, so we're going to be starting off with a video of the ancient Indus civilization. Actually, one moment.
This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Get access to my streaming video service, Nebula, when you sign up for CuriosityStream using the link in the description. It's British India in the 1920s, and over the last few decades, these odd stone seals keep popping up at ruins near Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, along the Indus River Valley. They baffle everyone with their inscriptions in a never-before-seen written language. Archaeologists, intrigued by this, started excavating these previously ignored sites. They soon uncovered a 4,500-year-old civilization. A civilization completely absent from the historical record. One of the earliest urban civilizations in human history. It flourished alongside ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China around 3,300 to 1900 BCE, but was bigger than all of them. A civilization that built wonders not to gods or to kings, but to sanitation. A civilization without war, made up of massive, planned cities built in brick. Masters of bronze and sculpture, they created their own writing system, traded across the vast sea, and possibly invented the world's first indoor toilets. And then vanished, for reasons still not completely understood. So what was this civilization in the Indus Valley? What did they achieve? And what does it have to do with rubber duckies? Well, let's find out. The Indus civilization existed from around 3300 BCE to around 1300 BCE, give or take a few centuries. But they really prospered around 4,500 years ago, between 2600 and 1900 BCE. It covered an area of over 1 million square kilometers. That's about one Bolivia, or two Spains, or even better, 6,250 Liechtensteins. It had the largest population and territory of all the Bronze Age civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and ancient China. Like almost all early civilizations, the Indus civilization developed around dank river valleys. Their farmers were able to grow a massive food surplus along the banks of the Indus and Ghaggar-Hakra rivers. Today the Indus is still a powerful river, but the Ghaggar-Hakra has almost completely dried up. Back then the Ghaggar-Hakra river may have actually been more productive than the Indus. We found much more settlements along the Ghaggar-Hakra than we have on the Indus. Since the Ghaggar-Hakra was much more powerful in the past, people think it actually might be the ancient lost Sarasvati River of Hindu literature. Since this civilization wasn't just based on the Indus, and since Indus-Sarasvati civilization is a bit of a mouthful, the term Harappan civilization is often used since Harappa was the first city of theirs we discovered. So I'll use that for the rest of the video. The Harappans weren't like other Bronze Age civilizations. The other ancient states like ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China all had the following ingredients. A strict hierarchy of classes. State monopolized use of violence. Power focused on individual leaders like kings and pharaohs. Centralized, state-controlled economies. Monumental religious and political structures. A powerful religious institution with its own hierarchy, and a strong sense of elitism and exclusivity. But we have no evidence of kings or priest kings for the Harappans. There are no royal tombs or palaces, no evidence for a state religion, no temples, pyramids or ziggurats, no signs of an army, weapons, slaves or powerful political capital. Now, the Harappans weren't some peaceful utopia. A state can't exist without violence. But it seems that they had no natural enemies, and they themselves seemed more interested in trade than conquest. All Harappan citizens seem to have lived relatively equal lives too. Rather than building palaces and temples, the Harappans seem to focus on building public baths and sewage systems. We have no idea how the Harappan government worked, but the Harappan civilization may have been split up into a number of different domains, each governed by a major city. Rather than kings, there may have been village, town, city, and then regional councils, all overseen by a supreme Harappan council. So rather than a Harappan Empire or Harappan Kingdom, it was probably a Harappan Federation, which kind of makes them sound very futuristic. One of the defining features of Harappan culture is how well planned their cities are. They tended to focus on three main aspects. 1. Water. Water, drainage and bathing held an almost religious significance in Harappan city planning. Every Harappan home had a dedicated bathing floor, used daily, built with watertight brick floors. These floors sloped towards a small drain, usually cut into the house wall, and this drain brought dirty water out of the house and into a brick-lined sewage system underneath the main streets, and channeled water out of the city. Some bathing rooms had small staircases so someone else could pour water over a bather, kind of like a proto-shower. Excavations at Harappa have uncovered toilets in almost every house. They were usually big pots sunk into the floor, although some at Mohenjo-Daro had seats. Waste from the toilets was directed into the drains and then out of the city, or into large jars sunk into the ground outside the home, kind of like an early septic tank. The Harappans had multi-storied buildings. When water had to be drained from upstairs, drains were often built inside or alongside the walls. This safely brought water and waste from higher floors down to street-level drains without soaking people below, which would have been a hazard the citizens of cities like ancient Rome would have had to deal with. We found quite a few ceramic toys in Harappan drains. It seems that Harappan children may have been the first to bring toys into the bath with them. This could be the earliest prototype of the rubber ducky. Other toys like puppets and carts, along with miniature cooking tools and other toy furniture, have also been found. Amongst all the ruins of the Harappans though, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro stands out. Nothing like it has been found in any other Harappan site. The Great Bath seems to be the only Harappan building with some sort of religious significance. This public bath is an impressive building, multi-storied with a 2.4 meter deep bathing pool in the centre. The pool is made from precisely fitted burnt bricks, coated with a layer of tar, making this one of the earliest examples of waterproofing in history. Here you can see the well and drain used to fill and empty the pool. We have no idea who used the Great Bath or why, but ritual bathing seems to be our best guess. The dedication put towards building such an impressive structure and its symbolic location in the largest Harappan city speaks volumes to the importance of water and bathing in Harappan society. Other impressive feats of water control include Dolavira's massive 16 man-made water reservoirs that surround the city and make it float. Lothal also had an impressive dock and canal system. 2. Standardization. Large Harappan cities were usually hundreds of kilometers apart, compared to Mesopotamian cities which were just on average 20 kilometers apart. The Harappan state maintained almost complete uniformity across these massive distances. Uniformity like standardized bricks. At every single Harappan site we found bricks that follow the exact same ratio, 1, 2, 4. This guaranteed good building standards across the Harappan world. Standardization extended to units of weight. We found cubical stone weights across big Harappan cities down to small farming villages. The smallest weight they had was 0.856 grams, and then the average weight was about 13.7 grams. 3. City planning. The main streets of Harappan cities were usually oriented north-south and east-west. These generally divided Harappan settlements into blocks. Narrow and often crooked lanes ran off the main streets, so the cities weren't built on an exact grid pattern. Access to the houses was from these lanes, avoiding the dust and noise of main streets. Walls usually surrounded Harappan settlements. There was usually a separately walled area built on a man-made mound known as a citadel. Here you would find most of the important buildings like warehouses, granaries, and at Mohenjo-Daro, the Great Bath. These citadels seem to have been built as defense against floods rather than armies though. For example, Mohenjo-Daro was built on two massive mounds that raised the city above the Indus River's floodplain. The walls supported the mounds and added extra flood defense. Mohenjo-Daro's higher western mound was their citadel, and it's about 12 meters above the plain, while a lower eastern mound held the lower town. This lower town had 40 to 80,000 people. Building these mounds was a huge investment. It is estimated to have taken 10,000 workers about 400 days to complete. All that work just to put the foundations of Mohenjo-Daro in place. When the city was founded, about 700 brick-lined wells were built to provide drinking water. No new wells were built over the many centuries of the city's existence, so the city's founders took the growth of the city into account when they built all 700. In some Harappan cities, we found the remains of brick platforms and trees
有
planted
太吃，
alongside the
听着
streets,
爸爸讲话
providing
吧，爸爸
public
茶杯
seating and
帮给爸
shade.
爸。
And we've even found large jars half sunk into the ground into which rubbish could be thrown, which was then brought to a nearby dump. Without the Rosetta Stone or Behustan inscriptions, we would never have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which has given us a wealth of information on both those civilizations. But we have nothing that useful to decipher Harappan writing, and so it remains undeciphered to this day. All we have to work with is the short inscriptions they left behind on these tiny stone seals. Every seal has two things: an image, usually an animal, and an inscription. The most common image on the seals seems to be this chunky unicorn. Now, those are archaeologists' words, not mine. I think calling this thing a unicorn is a bit of a stretch.
Come on, honey, make a birthday wish.
I want a unicorn.
Isn't that cute?
I'm a unicorn.
We have found thousands of Harappan seals. They seem to have had about 450 signs, and the script is logosyllabic, like Chinese or ancient Maya, which means each symbol stood for a word or syllable. It seems to have been written from right to left, as we can see because some scribes seem to have ran out of space on the left side. The seals could have been used like stamps, but it seems that they were more often used like identity cards or passports. Any Harappan writing on paper or papyrus has been destroyed by the passage of time. This may be why we've only found about 450 mostly repetitive signs. There could have been a bias towards the kind of words that were written on the seals, like names or jobs. And if we found a written document, we would find more common words and thus more signs. Imagine if people tried to reconstruct the English language using only the words that appeared on passports. The Harappan people were mostly farmers and herders. Barley and wheat were their main crops. And we can see the beginning of South Asia's spice obsession with the Harappans. Garlic, turmeric, ginger, cumin and cinnamon were all grown. Luckily, we've only found one trace of coriander, so that's good. Cattle and water buffalo were the most important domesticated animals, followed by sheep and goats. Chickens, camels and even elephants might also have been domesticated. We found tons of Harappan dog figurines, some wearing collars, which suggest that they had doggos, and possibly house cats. Paw prints made by a cat can be seen in a brick at Chihundaro that was drying as a cat ran across, quickly followed by a dog. In most parts of the world, when people settled down and started farming, they, to use a historian's term, super murdered the hunter-gatherer societies around them. The Harappans traded with them instead. Hunter-gatherers could collect exotic products like honey, wax, ivory, silk and wild plants. And in exchange they received Harappan crops and manufactured goods like bronze tools. The Harappans used the constantly moving hunter-gatherers and pastoral herders to move goods between cities, like a Harappan FedEx. But most Harappan internal trade was conducted on the rivers they controlled, and foreign trade was mostly conducted across the sea. We know that between 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Harappans traded with the Arabian Gulf, Mesopotamia, Central Asia and Iran. Before we invented radiocarbon dating, the only way we could date the Harappan civilization was because we found their seals in Mesopotamia. Being able to read Mesopotamian records made it possible to place the Harappans in time. Around 2600 to 2300 BCE, Mesopotamian records begin mentioning trade with a far-off land known as Malua. This was their name for the Harappans. Mesopotamian texts mention the following items as imports from Malua: lapis lazuli, gold, silver, copper, timber, ebony, ivory, tortoiseshell, chicken, buffalo, peacock, dog, cat and monkey apparently. Harappan merchants seem to have been a common sight in Mesopotamia, but Mesopotamian merchants never seem to have sailed outside the Gulf, which suggests that Harappans were the better merchants and sailors. This, along with the fact that they were shipping bulky goods like timber and wild animals, shows us that they must have had some pretty big boats. Very few Mesopotamian artifacts appear in the Harappan world, so we have no idea what the Harappans were trading all their goods for. We have discovered a toiletry set with a copper ear scoop and tweezers at Harappa, so maybe luxury or manufactured goods could have been what the Harappans wanted. Funnily enough, Harappan sailors acted a lot like sailors of later times, since we've discovered ivory dice for games and gambling at sites they visited. More than 1,000 kilometers from Harappa is an isolated Harappan town called Shortagai, located in modern-day Afghanistan. We found Harappan seals there, along with houses built to a Harappan design and bricks using the Harappan ratio. This was a Harappan colony. The Harappans used Shortagai to control the nearby lapis lazuli mines. This allowed the Harappans to monopolize the ancient world's supply of lapis lazuli. Interestingly, the Harappans didn't much care for lapis and used it almost entirely for export. This trade made the Harappans incredibly rich. But after 700 years of prosperity, the Harappan civilization went into a sudden decline around 1900 BCE. Cities stopped following strict plans, drains were no longer maintained, the Great Bath filled up with rubbish, and the art of writing was forgotten. There is no evidence for massacres, battles, or sieges at any Harappan sites, so the Harappans didn't meet a violent end. Factors such as reduction in trade, climate change, disease, and civil strife all probably played a role in their collapse, but it seems that the Sarasvati River played the biggest role. As we saw earlier, there was a dense cluster of Harappan cities along the Sarasvati River. This area was probably their breadbasket, but around 1900 BCE, the river began to dry up for reasons still being studied. Links discussing this are in the description. As the crops died out and cities were starved of water, the Harappans along the Sarasvati fled their homes in search of greener pastures. Some seem to have moved towards the Ganges, which would become the new centre of North Indian civilization. Others simply went back to a simpler style of living in small farming villages. By 1300 BCE, the entire Harappan system was gone. The memory of the Harappan civilization, their great cities, their beliefs, their language, and their writing system disappeared under the earth that once sustained them, until they are rediscovered 4,000 years later. The Harappans were one of the greatest Bronze Age civilizations, but they weren't the only one. The Bronze Age saw the rise of urban societies, vast trading empires, and military powers, from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia, all the way to ancient China. But how did all this come about, and why did it end? Well, this is all explained in The Bronze Age, a 3-part documentary series that you can go check out over on CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a documentary streaming service that gives you access this.
Alright, so we'll be going on to the Indian history, and this is part 1.
The history of India is filled with incredible stories of thriving civilizations, religions, and cultures. Dating all the way back to the Paleolithic age, India's civilization is one of the oldest that we know and has played a part on the world stage for centuries, and even still today. While it is impossible to truly capture all of India's history in one video, it still serves as a worthy topic to delve into. Evidence of cave paintings and stone tools have revealed that the first signs of human activity in India can be traced back to somewhere between 400,000 and 200,000 BC. Details concerning the civilizations inhabiting the region back that long ago do not exist, but we do know that one of the first sophisticated societies to walk the lands of India was the Harappan people, who likely existed throughout the first few thousand years BC. Positioned along the Indus River, the Harappan people had their own writing system, advanced social and economic system, and impressive urban cities and architecture. It is unknown why this civilization collapsed around 1500 BC, but some attribute their demise to the common floods and other natural disasters in the region, or potentially invaders from Western and Central Asia. The next known civilization to leave a mark on Indian history books was the Vedic Aryans. These people were initially migrants who spoke an early form of Sanskrit and were determined to stay true to their own tribal identity. The name they've been given, the Vedic people, comes from 4 sacred texts, or Vedas, that have presented researchers with a glimpse into the civilization's lives and beliefs. These Vedas are often considered to be the oldest Hindu scripts, and the Vedic civilization is believed to have spread their culture across a large portion of India by roughly 1000 BC. With them, the Vedic Aryans brought their philosophical beliefs. These ideas represent a theory that happiness and salvation come from a person's morals and ethics, and one's path should be based upon their place in life, but should always be righteous and good. The Vedic Aryans also shared their societal system as they extended their reach. This system was made up originally of 3 tiers: Brahmin, or priest, Kshatriya, or warrior, and Vaishya, or commoner. The Aryans continued to spread their tribal settlements across India throughout the following centuries as their own civilization grew and flourished, culture and trade, a series of 16 individual settlements or states spanned across northern India, including the Gandhara, Sala, Kuru, and the Magadh. The latter particularly flourished under the rule of Chandragupta Maurya during the 4th century BC, as it began to expand, and its leader grew his own authority to form the Mauryan Empire, which is believed to be the first Indian imperial power. The Mauryan Empire established its capital in Pataliputra, near modern-day Patna, and constructed extraordinary temples, libraries, palaces, and even a university. The empire's trade success was impressive, and it maintained a remarkable governmental system and strong army. By the time of the 3rd emperor, the grandson of Chandragupta, a stance of non-violence was taken after a bloody struggle against the kingdom of Kalinga due to the emperor's new Buddhist beliefs. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, had been born in 560 BC. Under the reign of Emperor Ashoka, the religious system he had founded was becoming more and more prevalent throughout India. Potentially due to their unwillingness to participate in conflict, though, the Mauryan Empire eventually dissolved in the 2nd century BC after the last line of the Maurya line, Brihadratha, was murdered by his commander-in-chief, who would later found the Shunga dynasty in 185 BC. Despite the fact that Brihadratha's assassin Pushyamitra was rumored to have persecuted Buddhists, it appeared that Buddhism faced no decline concurrent with his rise to power. During Pushyamitra's reign, his kingdom maintained authority over a series of provinces as he stood his ground against other powers attempting to expand their territory towards his own. After the monarch's death, though, his dynasty seemed to have fallen in terms of importance. The dynasty is not known to have done anything notably relevant, and their control was short-lived. A variety of settlements and invading powers controlled India at this time, one being the Kushana kingdom, known for their significant trade involvement with Chinese, Persian, and Roman empires along the Silk Road. One Kushana ruler, Kanishka, in the 1st century AD, also converted to Buddhism and helps to further the religion throughout the region. In 75 AD, the Kushana kingdom marked a new era, the Shaka era. A bit of distance from the Kushanas in the south, a handful of other powers rose, fell, and fought for supremacy amongst each other. The kingdoms of Satavahana, Chera, Chola, and Pandya were some of the major authorities in the south during this time and through the Classical Age. The Gupta Empire became the face of northern India during the Classical Age, and the majority of the region was united under their authority during what is often described as northern India's Golden Age. The reign of the Gupta Empire is regarded as a time of law and order, as well as cultural flourishing. The rulers of the empire were no strangers to military expedition, but aimed to expand their territory through peaceful means, such as martial alliances, no less than through military action. Though the Gupta Empire had extensive success over centuries, they eventually reached a point of decline between the 5th and 6th centuries as invading Huns from Central Asia began to annex and take over the formerly dominant empire's land. As the religions of Buddhism and what later became Hinduism thrived, local and trespassing authorities continued to fight for territory and dominion over the following centuries. The next major shakeup of the Indian civilization came with the arrival of Islam. Muslim invaders began to send missions to India the century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. A series of Muslim sultans began to lead expeditions into India, claiming places such as Sindh, Multan, and Somnath. These incursions brought the defeat of native kingdoms and the destruction of Hindu temples along the way. The Rajputs stood as one of the most determined defenders against Sultan invaders, but they were ultimately defeated in 1192 by Muhammad Ghori and his forces. As Islam began to work its way into India, other previously principal religions, such as Buddhism, began to decline. By the start of the 13th century, the era of the Delhi Sultanate's dominion arose. The first dynasty within the Delhi Sultanate was founded by Qutb-ud-Din Aibak. The slave dynasty controlled the Sultanate until around 1290, when the Khilji dynasty took over, first by the hand of Jahal-ud-Din Khilji. His family held the throne for less than a century, as the Tughlaq dynasty was next to seize power in 1320. The Tughlaq dynasty technically retained power until 1412, but matters were complicated by the incursion led by Timur in 1398 into Delhi. As the Tughlaq dynasty weakened, the Sayyid dynasty replaced them, starting in 1414. The Sayyids lasted for roughly 37 years, but the last ruler's reign was stained by rebellion and discord as the dynasty fell from grace. Yet another dynastic authority took the open throne, this time being the Lodi dynasty. The new dynasty lasted until the death of the then current ruler, Ibrahim Khan Lodi, who was killed in battle at Panipat by the army of Kabul's leader Babur in 1526. Ibrahim's death brought about the final end of the Delhi Sultanate as a whole. Now free of competition from the Lodi dynasty, Babur established the Mughal dynasty, which would end up becoming one of the greatest throughout history. The original Turkic-Mongol imperial power ruled a vast majority of India for over 2 centuries and brought about significant cultural growth and architectural achievements, including the Great Taj Mahal. Despite their immense success, the Mughal Empire began its decline around the start of the 18th century, as revolt after revolt began to shake the foundations of the widespread power, alongside threats from the Marathas and the British. The British East India Company had actually already been in the region for some time, but the situation with the British started to escalate not long after the Mughals fell. By 1857, India displayed increasing control by the East India Company, and the locals were having none of it. What began as a simple revolt by Indian soldiers in Meerut quickly blew up into a widespread rebellion and became known as the Indian Mutiny of 1857. This rebellion later would be called the First War of Indian Independence, and even though the British were able to quell the revolt after a matter of months, it inevitably had lasting impacts. In response to the mutiny, on November 1, 1858, Britain's Queen Victoria declared that India would be ruled in the name of the British Crown from that point on. Locals maintained their disapproval and anger at the British supremacy over their land, and nationalist sentiments and movements were far from extinguished. The next major move towards independence came when Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress decided to withdraw all cooperation with the British government, beginning the non-cooperation movement following the end of World War I. When this strategy did not bring the wanted results, Gandhi adopted a new technique in the form of the civil disobedience movement in December of 1929. Essentially, the movement was made up of the declaration of an Indian Independence Day that would be celebrated on January 16th, and complete disobedience of any orders by the British government. Again, Gandhi's strategy failed, and this time he was even arrested, while many other rebels were murdered. Still, the British were eventually pushed into the Round Table conferences beginning in November of 1930, the second of which Gandhi attended. The conferences marked another failure, and civil disobedience reignited. Gandhi's next attempt, the the Quit India movement again made no drastic progress. World War II brought about new issues as India was forced into war by the British, but at the conflict's conclusion, a new Labour Party came into power in India and showed sympathy towards the fight for independence. Finally, as August 14th turned to 15th in 1947, India became an independent nation.
This may come as a shock to you, but India is large. Truly, OSP delivers only the most insightful of analysis. But really, it's easy to forget the sheer size, density, and diversity of this subcontinent. The ancient and medieval periods have a lengthy and ever-changing cast of cool states and empires spread out across the many river valleys, mountains, and coasts. As I've previously lamented, this turns map-making into a downright perilous endeavor. But after 1500, we trade map simplicity for caste list complexity, as India sees the arrival of Diet Mongols and a metric Europe of colonizers. So, to see how a mosaic of medieval Indian states got thrown into the blender of British imperialism and came out as a modern nation, or three, let's do some history. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Start building your website today by going to squarespace.com/overlysarcastic. When last we left our game of squish a landmass the size of Europe into one cohesive story, the Muslim Delhi Sultanate was shrinking back towards the north, and Mongol splinter states were hanging out on the other side of the Hindu Kush Mountains. One such ruler in Central Asia, named Babur, was descended from both Tamerlane and Genghis Khan, but you wouldn't be able to tell that from his military record. He got kicked out of his ancestral homeland and spent 20 years trying to set up camp in India during the early 1500s. It was attempt number 5 that successfully toppled the Delhi Sultanate and established the Mughal dynasty, but his troubles endured. This poor guy wrote in his journals wondering why forts and cities along the Ganges River weren't welcoming their new ruler with open arms, as if for some reason a conquering stranger wasn't a normal feature of the neighborhood. Babur also complained bitterly about the Indian heat, so I'm filing him under guys who just can't seem to win. Babur's son wasn't much better off, getting exiled in 1540 after a string of defeats and only reclaiming his capital in time to die by falling down a steep flight of stairs. So, his son Akbar took the throne in 1556 and treated the Mughal Empire to a king who wasn't existentially clumsy. Akbar's 5 decades on the throne and a series of smart reforms quickly brought the empire to its peak. He overhauled the imperial government to actually make it work, he added native Indians and local princes into his Muslim-majority government, and he worked to blend the cultures of India and Persia. In doing so, Akbar made people and scholars of all religions feel welcome. This is probably the height of state-supported Indian diversity, and while some were rather off-put by the increasing cultishness of Akbar's trans-theological emperor worship, most Indians were just happy to be included. His reforms also made the economy go smoother on account of standardized taxes that could be paid in cash, which also let them tax the merchant trade. And the Mughals didn't leave all that cash-collecting dust in an imperial treasury, they turned it into cold, hard architecture. Like this, and that. Shiny. The other half of imperial expenditures went towards conquest, expanding the Mughal Empire down the Indian peninsula and back out to the Mughal heartland of Central Asia. This, by contrast, went on to be ruinously expensive for almost zero actual benefit, and later Mughal emperors pursued a policy of why not more empire without considering just how much money they were blowing to make it happen. By the time of Akbar's grandson Aurangzeb, the empire was covered in spiffy monuments and positively baller forts, but it was nearly broke, the government was squabbling with itself, and the army was too bloated to do anything. After Aurangzeb died, his sons were too busy fighting a civil war to realize their empire went poof, and within a half-century the Mughal kings were made into vassals of the fast-growing Maratha Empire. What they lacked in numbers compared to the unwieldy Mughal armies, they more than made up for in organization and effectiveness. So after about a century and a half of flying high, the kingdom was crumbling, Delhi got sacked by Persia, and the Mughals were confined to figurehead status from then on. Normally, this would lead to a quiet couple centuries in Indian history, but this time there were colonies to be made. So let's wind back the clock 200 years to see what those wily Europeans had been up to in the meantime. After Vasco da Gama realized you could sail underneath Africa without no-clipping off the edge of the map, Portugal became the first European power to reach the coast of India. During the 1500s, they built 24 coastal and island forts around the peninsula and developed a robust system of extorting innocent merchants for protection money. Their actual imports consisted of mostly Indian pepper, since it was very expensive for how little cargo space it took up, but all that aside, Portugal's presence in the Indian Ocean wasn't much more than a passive annoyance, since the Mughals were able to smack them around if they ever tried to muscle inland. India might not have seen much of a change, but Portugal carted back a mountain of ill-gotten treasure, and other European seafarers wanted their turn on the carousel of cash. So in the early 1600s, the English, Dutch, and French created private companies dedicated to exploring and extorting the East Indies. By 1700, France, Britain, and the Netherlands had their run of the Indian Ocean because the Mughals didn't have a navy to speak of even before they nosedived into irrelevance. This power vacuum made the Europeans bolder, and in a classic case of, well, if someone is gonna conquer this place, it might as well be me, they started throwing hands about it. This came to a head in the 7 Years' War between technically everyone, but really England and France. Despite the request of King and Parliament to not build a land empire in Asia, the British East India Company saw too much potential profit to let their powers slip. So they rolled up to the French allied state of Bengal, usurped the king, and annexed the entire state. Yikes. In the following decade, Britain's victory in the not 7 years long 7 Years' War let them push France out of India, and by 1800 the East India Company was well on its way to subduing the entire subcontinent. The British Empire had, again, politely requested that the EIC not colonize one metric Europe, but it was way too easy. The company had a private army of 250,000 Indian soldiers on the payroll, and they had a lot of success in playing small Indian states against each other, and sometimes they didn't even need to fight when a well-placed bribe would get the job done. So the conquest cost a pretty penny, sure, but it was almost entirely consequence-free. Ah, corporate geopolitics. The stuff of nightmares. Now, beyond simply extracting tolls from trade and bringing all those good silks and spices back to Britain, the company upgraded to tax collecting. They also owned the land, so the EIC shifted agriculture away from dumb, low-margin stuff like food to focus on cash crops like cotton and, starting in the 1820s, tea. While early company governors had ruled indirectly by way of vassal princes and at least pretended like they wanted to treat the native Indians fairly, the mid-19th century saw all of that go away. The company dismissed the native princes, forced the farmers into tenancy, and put tradespeople out of work by shifting production to the industrial factories in Britain. But it's all okay. The East India Company's stockholders were seeing a really great return on their investment. So it's worth it. Priorities. Now, if you were, say, a native Indian steadily watching your rights erode as your absentee overlords drained your land of everything it's worth, this was enough to ruin the mood. But in the 1850s, life got even harder for the legions of Indian sepoys fighting in the EIC army. They faced religious discrimination, pay cuts, no promotions ever, and the increasing sense that white British officers were never going to take a dark-skinned person seriously. Meanwhile, local lords had their lands confiscated on ever more dubious grounds, and in 1857, a rebellion of one sepoy garrison quickly set off a slew of revolts across North India in an attempt to give Britain the boot. The company met this unrest with characteristic extreme brutality and massive destruction to farmland, which combined for a body count in the hundreds of thousands. At this point, Queen Victoria and friends decided that the EIC had lost its existing privileges, so the company was dissolved and control of India passed directly to the British Crown. From 1858 onward, the British Raj nominally made life better for Indians with the creation of an Indian civil service and the partial recognition of sovereignty to a series of princely states, but in reality, the Raj was just a more official system of wealth extraction and racial oppression that had been going on for over a century. British advisors had final say over the independent principalities, and participation in the Indian civil service was limited to candidates who could take an entrance exam in London. Tells you a little bit about who they wanted running the place. And this contributed to a revealing double standard of how Britain and India viewed the empire, or, Britain and anyone else for that matter. In London, you'd see the fruits of humanistic multiculturalism in food, art, demographics, and mind-numbing economic power. But back in India, it just looked like some domineering colonizers came to take the shiny stuff and stomp on the rest to satisfy a racist power trip. Naturally, this led leading Indian politicians and thinkers to consider the potential joys of not being oppressed, and in 1885 the Indian National Congress pushed to give Indians a greater voice in their own government, but Britain's counteroffer was that they would get nothing and like it, a shockingly effective negotiating tactic thus far. Now at this point it seemed like there was no way this finely tuned system of colonial exploitation could possibly come undone, but we've got to remember that this whole enterprise was a cash grab, so if India ever stopped being profitable, why keep it? And nothing will sink a profit margin faster than a good old-fashioned world war, better yet, 2 of them. When war struck in 1914, the Raj supported the Entente against the Central Powers with supplies and soldiers. This got a little awkward when Indians heard the British propaganda calling World War I a fight for democracy, as they could be forgiven for not realizing that Britain was into that. So it became harder to reinforce the post-war same old after India sacrificed so much for Britain's war. In World War II, Deutschland Boogaloo, India provided 2.5 million soldiers, loaned some 10 million pounds sterling to the British government, and provided critical supplies at tremendous cost to India itself. To make matters worse, Britain went all scorched earth on their own province of Bengal to deter the Japanese Empire from muscling into eastern India, and 3 million people died in the resulting famine. And our old pal Winnie Churchill remained fiercely imperialist throughout the end of the war, offering only the most flaccid concessions of greater Indian sovereignty. But by 1945, London was cleaning up a metric blitz, the empire was bankrupt, and Indian leaders like Gandhi were intensely campaigning for independence, so Britain cut their losses by just letting India go. Still not the least bit interested in India's actual well-being, the British Viceroy organized a partition and complete dissolution of the Raj in just 5 months. The government had 1 semester of college to draw new borders and fully withdraw. The basic idea was to make a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan, but demographics don't work like that, so after partition in 1947, there were millions of people that found themselves on the wrong side of these new borders. This ensuing mass migration quickly devolved into extreme violence and produced an animosity between India and Pakistan that endures to this day. Dark! So, that wraps up our history of India and also now Pakistan and Bangladesh. For many reasons, it's a tough history to grapple with because there's so much going on over such a great length of time. But as we've seen, the sheer diversity of people, cultures, and historical happenings makes this corner of the world so fascinating. That said, it does make it kinda hard to write a comprehensive and satisfying concluding paragraph.
But you know what's easy?
Making a website with squares. This may come as a shock to
India's modern history consists of war, rebellion, independence, and all that comes along with the establishment of a new nation. From world wars to independence from the British to the Indo-Pakistan wars, a lot has happened for the young sovereign state in the past century. When World War I broke out, India was still under the British Crown and was, therefore, an automatic contributor to the Triple Entente's war efforts. Over 1 million Indian troops joined the fight, making the Indian Army one of the largest armies involved. In the Second World War, India sent over 2.5 million troops to fight under British command. While India itself was not really in a position of authority during these wars, due to their contemporary lack of independence, both events were still a notable part of the country's history, given the number of men who joined the fight alongside Britain.
This video was sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. Because I like to create videos about history, I seek to know
India's modern history consists of war. Events were still a notable part of the country's history, given the number. Allies won World War. Though the Allies won World War II, the effects of the conflict were impressively damaging for the British Empire. Agreements with the United States led Britain to begin decolonizing many of its territories and paved the way for India's independence movement to be accelerated. On June 3, 1947, the last British Governor-General of India, Viscount Louis Mountbatten, declared the partitioning of British India into India and Pakistan, and the nations became their own sovereign states by August 15th of the same year. This break from the British Crown gave both countries the choice of staying in or leaving the British Commonwealth, but in 1949, India chose to stay. By this point, Jawaharlal Nehru had become independent India's first Prime Minister after serving as the leader of the Indian National Congress prior to 1947. The Deputy Prime Minister was Vallabhbhai Patel, who played a significant role in teaming up with Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru during the independence movement. Under
his and Prime Minister Nehru's watchful eyes, a dramatic population exchange occurred between the Hindu majority of India and the Muslim majority of Pakistan, in addition to the First Kashmir War between the young neighboring nations. The first of 4 Indo-Pakistani conflicts, the Kashmir War, was a conflict over the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir and lasted from 1947 through 1948. While the provinces of Bengal and Punjab were to be divided between the newly formed India and Pakistan, the fate of Jammu and Kashmir was still unsettled, and Pakistan, anticipating the dissension, decided to mobilize tribal militia groups from Waziristan a few weeks before the war actually broke out. The reason why Jammu and Kashmir's destiny was so uncertain was due to the fact that the princely state was led by a Hindu Maharaja but was made up of a Muslim majority. There was heavy pressure from both sides to a siege to either India or Pakistan, but some citizens of the state were even considering a push for complete independence from both countries. Tensions boiled over at the start of October 1947 when a pro-Pakistani tribal rebellion in Kashmir broke out, and the Pakistani troops quickly came to their aid. Pakistan's goal was to seize the capital, Srinagar, within the first weeks of their arrival. Eventually, the Maharaja called on India for military assistance, and India agreed under the condition that Kashmir become part of India. The state's Prime Minister and Maharaja both accepted, and the instrument of accession was signed on October 26, 1947. Still, Pakistan and their tribal allies were unwilling to give up the fight. Combat continued until December of 1948, and there didn't seem to be an easy solution without major reinforcements and aggressive action from the Indian side. Desperate for a resolution, India approached the United Nations for support, and a ceasefire between India and Pakistan was reached with the UN's help on January 1st, 1949. The same year, other princely states, such as Manipur and Tripura, also acceded to India, and the nation's constitution was close to being established. In November of 1949, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his committee drafted the official Constitution of India, which would come into effect and turn the country into an independent democratic republic on January 26, 1950, and Dr. Rajendra Prasad would become the first president of the republic. The first democratic elections were held in India in 1951 through 1952 over a 4-month span and brought a turnout of over 60%, re-electing both Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and President Rajendra Prasad for second terms. During Nehru's second term, many reforms and legislative changes were made, and a Soviet-inspired 5-year plan was composed for the economy. Rights for women in Hindu societies were increased, caste discrimination was condemned with new legislation, and school education was encouraged. Nehru also appointed the States Reorganization Commission, which led to the passage of the States Reorganization Act in 1956. Many state borders were rearranged to create a better separation of linguistic and ethnic majorities as part of this decision. Many other milestones were reached during this time as well, including the launching of an atomic energy program in 1954, India's first computer being installed in 1955. Foreign policy under Nehru involved the co-founding of the Non-Aligned Movement, maintaining friendly relations with both the US and the Soviet Union. Despite this more neutral stance though, India decided in 1961 to invade and annex Portugal's colony of Goa after repeated unsuccessful petitions for a peaceful transfer. The following year, the Sino-Indian War between China and India briefly broke out due to a dispute over the Himalayan border, but a ceasefire was unilaterally declared by China only a month after the conflict began. There was a short span of peace, during which Prime Minister Nehru passed away on May 27, 1964, and was succeeded by Lal Bahadur Shastri. In 1965, India was again into war with Pakistan over the state of Kashmir. No notable changes were made by the warfare, and a ceasefire was eventually pushed on both sides by foreign powers who feared escalation. The Tashkent Agreement was signed by India and Pakistan on January 10, 1966, and had been mediated by the Soviet Union. Mysteriously, Prime Minister Shastri died the night after the agreement was signed. Either way, the Prime Minister's untimely death resulted in Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Nehru, taking Shastri's place. In the next year's election, the Indian National Congress Party won fewer seats than they had in the past, likely due to the growing unemployment, economic stagnation, and rising prices brought about by the party's leadership so far. The Prime Minister's political advisor came to the aid of her reputation, however, and advised a shift towards more socialist policies, including the slashing of the Privy Purse Agreement, which gave payments to ruling families of the former princely states as part of their original deal to accede to India back in 1947. Prime Minister Gandhi's other decisions, including major attacks on the Congress Party's hierarchy and the subject of nationalizing the nation's bank, earned her increased popularity amongst the masses. Gandhi won re-election in 1971 and had now obtained an even larger majority, which only grew further as a result of her decision to intervene in the Bangladesh Liberation War, bringing about the Third Indo-Pakistani War. The conflict resulted in the freedom of East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. India also increased its involvement in world affairs, signing a 20-year Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in August of 1971, aligning with the Soviet Union and adding strain to its relationship with the United States. In 1973, a rebellion broke out in the Kingdom of Sikkim, led by anti-royalist rioters who wished to abolish the monarchy. After 2 years of discord, Sikkim's prime minister reached out to India's government with an appeal for Sikkim to become an Indian state. The offer was taken, and the Indian army made their way to Gangtok in order to get some control in the region and disarm the Sikkim Palace Guards. A referendum was then held, showing a 97.5% favor for putting an end to the monarchy and integrating into India. On May 16, 1975, that wish became a reality, making Sikkim the 22nd state of the Indian Union. While India grew, Prime Minister Gandhi's popularity now took a downward spiral as allegations of corruption from the people. Indira Gandhi's power was at risk as her opposition from all sides came together to protest the Prime Minister's accused dictatorship. She eventually advised President Ali Ahmed to declare a state of emergency in order to give her additional powers and the ability to suspend the civil liberties of their citizens under the guise of maintaining law and order. State and national elections were also postponed, and almost 1,000 members of the opposition were thrown into prisons, protests being banned indefinitely. While the economy was actually improving by the lack of political unrest and new productivity, the government was continuously accused of corruption and abuses of power, making it no surprise that Indira Gandhi and her Congress Party were routed in the 1977 general elections by the Janata Party. Morarji Desai became the new Prime Minister. Then, Charan Singh became the 5th Prime Minister in 1979 as the Janata coalition fell into disarray. Singh's interim government was replaced in January of 1980 by Indira Gandhi and her Congress Party once again, although after a rise in tensions and violence in the Sikh community of India following Operation Blue Star and the raid of the Golden Temple, which was being used by rebellious Khalistan militants as a hideout, Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards in 1984. Anti-Sikh riots erupted in Delhi, and thousands of Sikhs perished as a result. Members of Congress were accused of inciting the violence, but the party was fairly unfazed and moved on to choose Rajiv Gandhi, Indira's eldest son, as her replacement. Under Rajiv's administration, Parliament was dissolved in 1989, the Congress Party gained a 415 to 545 majority, and many reforms took place, as well as improved relations with the United States. Prime Minister Rajiv had a mostly flawless reputation, known by the press as Mr. Clean, until a scandal was unearthed, revealing that a weapons contract between India and Sweden provided kickbacks from the Swedish arms dealer for multiple politicians on both sides, including Rajiv Gandhi himself. The Congress Party's popularity plummeted once again, and Singh became the next prime minister after the 1989 elections. More governmental unrest followed, until Narasimha Rao took power in 1991 and made sweeping economic and political reforms. While the Bombay riots and other Hindu-Muslim conflicts exploded across India, new corruption stripped most support from Rao's administration and party, and they were humiliated at the next election by the Bharatiya Janata Party. Under this party's new leadership, relations with the US greatly improved, and the American President Bill Clinton made a visit to India to promote the relationship even further. Attempts were also made to create more friendly ties with Pakistan, but a failed summit in 2001 brought about no real change. Today, India is still a developing nation with almost 1.4 billion people and so many ethnicities. While the history of India is rich and vast, the independent nation is still growing into a truly strong and developed country of its own.
All right, so I don't think we have enough time to do the Kahoot, so unfortunately I'll have to stop it there. But that should be all for the entire presentation now.
Oh, thank you very much, Sean, for your India cultural share. And sorry before I mute.